€3,080,000,000,000. That's how much Italy owes. The world's third largest sovereign debt, right behind the United States and Japan. Italy's debt is larger than the combined economies of Sweden, Austria, and Portugal, more than double their combined GDPs. And here's what makes no sense. Italy's debt to GDP sits at 137.8%, second only to Greece in the Eurozone. Yet bond spreads are at 15-year lows. Something doesn't add up. And if you think this is just Europe's problem, think again. 3 words saved Italy from collapse: whatever it takes. But Italy's real problem started decades earlier, with a decision that most Italians have never even heard of. What happens when those words aren't enough anymore? To understand why Italy matters, you need to understand why Greece was just the trailer. Greece could be bailed out. When their crisis hit, Europe scrambled together 289 to 350 billion euros. It was painful. It was messy. But they did it. Italy is 3.08 trillion euros in public debt. As economist Nouriel Roubini put it is too big to fail, but too big to be saved. Do the math. The European Stability Mechanism's entire lending capacity is 500 billion euros. That wouldn't even cover 2 years of Italy's refinancing needs. Italy rolls over 250 to 300 billion euros of debt every single year. But the contagion goes further. Italian banks hold sovereign debt equal to 100% of their core capital. French banks are the most heavily exposed to Italian debt in Europe. German banks have 162 billion euros on the line. If Italy defaults, according to the Brookings Institution, it would almost surely force defaults by Spain, Portugal, and perhaps Ireland. If you have a pension, a 401k with European exposure, or savings in euros, this is your problem too. But how did Europe's third largest economy become a financial hostage? The answer starts with a decision made in 1981 that nobody talks about. The true origin of Italy's debt crisis isn't the euro. It's not the 2008 financial crisis. It's a bureaucratic decision made in 1981 that changed everything. They called it the Divorzio, the divorce between the Italian Treasury and the Bank of Italy. Before 1981, Italy had a cozy arrangement. The central bank was legally obligated to buy any government bonds the market didn't want. The government could spend whatever it wanted, and the Bank of Italy would print the difference. Then, Finance Minister Beniamino Andreatta and Bank of Italy Governor Carlo Azeglio Ciampi decided to end this arrangement. The goal was noble: stop inflation, impose fiscal discipline. The unintended consequence was catastrophic. Suddenly, the government had to sell bonds at market rates. Interest rates on government debt skyrocketed, and Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio exploded from 57.7% in 1980 to 124.3% by 1994. Let that sink in. The debt crossed 100% of GDP in 1992. It has never come back down. But Italy had a secret weapon: the ability to devalue. When the Italian economy lost competitiveness, they simply devalued the lira. In 1979, when Italy joined the European monetary system, you needed 443 lira to buy 1 Deutschmark. By 1995, 1,000 lira. That's 125% devaluation in just 16 years. In 1992, during the ERM crisis, Italy devalued the lira by 22% against the Deutschmark. Exports boomed, competitiveness restored, crisis averted. Italy's repeated devaluations were the pressure valve that kept the system functioning despite weak productivity and political chaos. Then Italy gave up that valve, forever. February 7, 1992. The Maastricht Treaty is signed. To join the Eurozone, Countries need debt below 60% of GDP. Italy had 120%. So how did Italy get in? Here's where it gets ugly. Italy used financial derivatives and currency swaps arranged by Morgan Stanley and J.P. Morgan to artificially reduce their deficit figures. Italy paid Morgan Stanley $3.4 billion to terminate these derivatives contracts in 2011 through 2012. Three independent experts calculated Italy was facing potential losses of 8 billion euros on 31.7 billion euros in notional value. If you're thinking, this sounds like accounting fraud, you're not wrong. And Italy wasn't alone. France, Spain, and Greece all used similar tricks. Greece famously used a 2.8 billion euro swap with Goldman Sachs. Eurostat banned this accounting method in 2008, years after the damage was done. January 1, 1999. Italy adopts the euro. January 1, 2002, the physical lira disappears forever. The promise was fiscal consolidation, structural reforms, growth above the EU average. The reality? According to Bruegel, Italy's economy has barely grown since joining the euro in 1999. Italy's share of EU GDP fell from 14.2% in 2005 to just 12% today. Italy joined a currency union designed for an economy it didn't have: high productivity, flexible labor markets, fiscal discipline, strong institutions. For a decade, it looked like Italy had pulled it off. Then came 2008, and everything unraveled. Date: August 5, 2011. A confidential letter lands on Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi's desk. Co-signed by ECB President Jean-Claude Trichet and incoming President Mario Draghi. The demands were blunt: accelerate balanced budget to 2013, raise the retirement age, cut public sector wages, implement a constitutional fiscal rule, liberalize labor markets. The quid pro quo was clear: implement reforms and the ECB buys Italian bonds. This letter was meant to be secret. The ECB refused a Freedom of Information request. But on September 29, 2011, it was leaked to Corriere della Sera. This was the moment Italy learned who really runs the Eurozone: unelected central bankers dictating policy to a democratic government. But the worst was yet to come. Watch the spreads. This is where the crisis turns existential. August 4, 2011. The BTP Bund spread hits 389 basis points, the day before the Trichet-Draghi letter. October 22, 2011. Spreads keep climbing. And at an EU summit, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy are asked about Berlusconi's reform promises. They exchange a smirk. That smirk is caught on camera. It goes viral. The message is clear: they don't believe him. November 8, 2011. Spreads blow past 500 basis points. November 9, 2011. The all-time high: 553 basis points. Italy's 10-year yield hits just over 7%. This is the danger zone. 7% yields had triggered bailouts for Portugal and Ireland. At these rates, Italy couldn't afford to roll over its 2+ trillion euros in debt. The math simply didn't work. November 12, 2011. Berlusconi falls. The budget vote passes with only 308 votes out of 630 MPAs. Crowds gather outside the Quirinal Palace singing Hallelujah. Italy's longest-serving post-war prime minister, 17 years in power, is forced out. Not by voters, by markets. 3 days later, Mario Monti, an unelected technocrat, a former European commissioner, is named prime minister. By November 16th, an all-technocrat government is sworn in. Not a single elected official. A government formed in less than 72 hours. Democracy? On hold. Now, here's where it gets technical. But stay with me, because this is the mechanism that holds Italy hostage to this day. Imagine a family where the parents' paychecks depend on the value of their house, but the house's value depends on the parents' job security. If either one wobbles, both collapse. That's the doom loop. Here's how it works in Italy. Investor confidence drops. Bond prices fall. Yields rise. Italian banks hold 125 to 200 billion euros in Italian government bonds. When bond prices fall, that's mark-to-market losses. Bank capital erodes. Bank funding costs rise. For every 100 basis point increase in the spread, deposit rates rise by 40 basis points. Weakened banks reduce lending. Credit crunch. Economic slowdown. Tax revenues fall. Welfare spending rises. Government finances deteriorate. The government may need to bail out the banks. The sovereign position worsens. Investor confidence drops further. And the loop repeats, faster and faster. Why do Italian banks hold so much government debt? Zero risk weighting under Basel rules. No capital required. Higher yields than German Bunds. Attractive returns. They can use it as ECB collateral. And there's government moral suasion, pressure to support national debt. Look at the exposure. These numbers are staggering. Banco BPM, 327% of Tier 1 capital in sovereign exposure. Monte dei Paschi di Siena, the world's oldest bank, founded in 1472, 206%. BPER Banca, 176%. Unicredit and Intesa Sanpaolo, around 145%. As economist Luis Garicano put it, Italian banks hold sovereign debt equal to 100% of their core capital. If Italy defaults, these banks fail. Not might fail. Fail. Definitively. Now, you might think the response to this doom loop would be to break it, to get Italian banks to diversify away from government bonds. Instead, Europe did the opposite. They handed Italian banks €1 trillion and said, buy more. I'm not joking. December 2011 and February 2012, the ECB launches its long-term refinancing operations. They lend over €1 trillion to European banks at just 1% interest for 3 years. Italian banks borrow 268 to 281 billion euros. What do they do with it? They buy high-yielding Italian bonds. Borrow at 1%, buy bonds yielding 5 to 6%. Pocket the difference. The carry trade. The perverse outcome. When international investors fled, Italian banks increased their BTP purchases by 250 billion euros over 2 years. They didn't escape the doom loop, they deepened it. This pattern repeated in 2018. After the elections triggered a political crisis, foreign investors dumped 58 billion euros in Italian bonds in just 2 months. Italian banks absorbed the selling, increasing their holdings by 28 billion euros. The pattern is clear. Domestic banks absorb what foreigners flee. Every crisis tightens the doom loop. But here's the thing. Debt is just the symptom. The disease is productivity. And this is where Italy's situation becomes truly hopeless. Look at these numbers. From 1995 to 2024, Italy, productivity grew 0.2% per year. Germany, 1.0%. France, 0.8%. Cumulative productivity growth from 2003 to 2023, Italy, 2.5%. Germany, 16%. France, 9.7%. The gap is enormous and widening. And here's the gut punch. Average annual wages in Italy went from $50,500 in 2000 to $48,900 in 2023. They went down. In Germany, wages rose from 57,300 to 65,700. In France, from 49,800 to 59,000. Italians are literally getting poorer while the rest of Europe gets richer. Why? 5 structural reasons. First, small firm dominance. 93 to 95% of Italian companies have fewer than 10 employees. Italian firms average 4.1 employees versus Germany's 12.3. Large companies are 70 to 80% more productive. Italy's economy is built on micro-enterprises that can't achieve economies of scale. Second, familism and cronyism. Research from Pellegrino and Zingales at NBER found Italy ranked last for meritocracy in manager selection. Last. Firms use nepotism for promotions, blocking talented workers. The cost? 13 to 16% of cumulative productivity growth lost to keeping incompetent family members in charge. Third, brain drain. In 2024, 156,000 Italian citizens left, up 36.5% from the year before, the highest emigration in 25 years. More than 1 million Italians have left in the past decade, a third of them aged 25 to 34. The cost? 134 billion euros between 2011 and 2023, according to the Northeast Foundation. 14 billion euros a year, according to Confindustria. Here's a statistic that should haunt every Italian policymaker. For every young foreigner settling in Italy, 9 young Italians leave. Fourth, R&D and skills gap. Italy spends 1.0 to 1.3% of GDP on R&D. Germany spends 2.8%. Only 16% of Italian workers have high ICT skills versus 30% in Germany and France. Only 15% of graduates are in STEM fields versus 26% EU average. Fifth, the North-South divide. GDP in 2023, 709 billion euros in the north versus 322 billion in the south. GDP per capita in Lombardy, 44,000 euros, 127% of the EU average. In Calabria, just 17,300 euros, only 56% of the EU average. Italy isn't one economy. It's 2 economies duct-taped together. The North could compete with Germany. The South is closer to Greece. Bank of Italy Governor Fabio Panetta warned in 2024 that demographic crisis and brain drain are major threats to Italy's economy. The working-age population is set to shrink by 7 million by 2050. By summer 2012, Italy was days from market shutdown. Spreads had risen back above 500. On July 24th, they hit 572 basis points intraday. And then, Mario Draghi walked to a podium in London. Date: July 26, 2012. Location: Global Investment Conference, London. Draghi stepped to the microphone and said 9 words that changed everything. Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough. He followed with this metaphor. The euro is like a bumblebee. This is a mystery of nature because it shouldn't fly, but instead, it does. So the euro was a bumblebee that flew very well for several years. The euro is now graduating to a real B. Italian yields dropped from over 6.5% toward 5% in days. The ECB announced outright monetary transactions on August 2nd. Here's the kicker. OMT was never actually used. Not once. The mere announcement was enough. The power of words, from the right person at the right moment. But Draghi's magic words came with a hidden cost. To save Italy, Europe demanded a pound of flesh. December 2011. Mario Monti unveils Salva Italia, Save Italy. 63 billion euros in fiscal consolidation over 3 years. The prescription? Austerity. Tax increases. The IMU property tax comes back. VAT rises to 21%. Fuel taxes go up. Taxes on households climb to 44.7% of gross income, already among the highest in Europe at 45+% of GDP. Pension reform. The Fornero reform raises the retirement age to 67, shifts to a notional defined contribution system, eliminates early retirement options. Labor Minister Elsa Fornero actually cried during the press conference announcing it. Spending cuts? Minimal. Just 1 to 8 billion euros, less than 1% of the budget. Most cuts were just reduced transfers to local governments. This was bad austerity, and I'll explain exactly why that matters. There's good austerity and bad austerity. Good austerity cuts wasteful spending while implementing pro-growth reforms. Bad austerity raises taxes on an already struggling economy. Italy chose the bad kind. What was supposed to happen? Cut spending, reduce deficit, debt to GDP falls, confidence returns, growth resumes. What actually happened? 2011. GDP contracts 2.4%. 2012. GDP contracts 2.2%. 2013. GDP contracts 1.7%. 2014. Still contracting. Debt to GDP hits 131%. Household consumption falls to 1997 levels. 3 consecutive years of recession, and the debt ratio kept climbing. Here's the brutal irony. Every euro they cut made the debt problem worse, not better. The IMF's Blanchard-Lee analysis found that governments massively underestimated fiscal multipliers. For every 1% of GDP in fiscal consolidation, growth fell 0.6 to 1.0% more than expected. The math that broke Italy. Austerity cuts spending. Domestic demand collapses. GDP falls. Tax revenues fall. The deficit doesn't improve. Same debt divided by smaller GDP equals a higher debt to GDP ratio. Markets see the rising ratio. Interest rates rise. Higher rates mean more interest spending, even worse deficit, and the loop repeats. If this sounds insane, that's because it is. The Italian Ministry of Finance's own internal estimate, austerity policies during 2012 to 2015 reduced GDP by almost 5% and investment by 10%. They made the patient sicker trying to cure them. Before the euro, Italy could devalue to restore competitiveness. After the euro, Italy was locked into a currency with Germany, unable to adjust. Italy is like a patient who needs surgery, but the doctor only has aspirin. The euro took away Italy's scalpel, the ability to devalue, and left them with only the painful option of austerity. By 2009, Germany had a cumulative price advantage of roughly 30 percentage points over Italy, Greece, and Spain. Unit labor costs had completely diverged. German workers became 30% cheaper relative to Italian workers, without any change in actual wages. So why doesn't Italy just leave the euro? More austerity? Already tried, already failed. Kills growth, increases debt to GDP. Politically impossible. Nobody will vote for more pain. Inflate away the debt? Italy doesn't control its own currency. The ECB sets policy. Germany would never allow it. Default or restructure? Triggers immediate banking crisis. European banks face massive losses. Would likely cause euro collapse. Contagion everywhere. Leave the euro? It'll exit? The new currency would devalue 30 to 50%. All euro-denominated debts become unpayable. Massive capital flight, bank runs, chaos. A 2012 Italian government internal study concluded exit was practically impossible. Exiting would add 570 billion euros, 36% of GDP, to foreign-denominated debts, and Italy's Target 2 liability of 447 billion euros creates an additional exit barrier. Here's the paradox that nobody talks about. Despite all the Eurosceptic politics, 71% of Italians actually support the euro. The Italexit party got just 2% in the 2022 elections, below the parliamentary threshold. Italians complain about the euro, but they don't actually want to leave. And then there's the governance problem. This is often overlooked, but it's crucial. Italy has had approximately 70 governments in 80 years since World War II, 64 governments since the Republic was proclaimed in 1946, 32 different prime ministers. That's one new government every 1.1 to 1.3 years. Compare that to the UK with about 30 governments in the same period, Germany with 24. Long-term reforms require consistent implementation over years. You can't fix structural problems if the government changes every 13 months. As one analyst put it, Draghi's reforms may have worked if he had 10 years rather than 21 months. Debt increased from 103% in 2007 to 127% in 2012, despite austerity. 63 billion euros in consolidation, and the debt ratio rose anyway. Youth unemployment in January 2014 hit 42%. Today, it's still 18 to 20%, versus Germany's 6%. So austerity failed. The doom loop remained. Productivity kept falling. And then Italians did something no one expected. They voted for chaos. Hey, quick question for the comments. If you were an Italian voter in 2018, would you vote for the populists promising change, or stick with the establishment that created this mess? Let me know below. The 2018 elections were a revolution. The Five Star Movement, founded in 2009 by a comedian named Beppe Grillo, became the largest party with 33% of the vote. Anti-elite, anti-austerity, Eurosceptic. The Lega, transformed under Matteo Salvini, took 17%. Italy First, anti-immigration. Together they formed a coalition government, the first major EU country with a populist government. Their platform explicitly rejected austerity, basic income, flat tax, pension reform reversal. The technocrats had failed. Now the populists would try. October 2018. Italy proposes a 2.4% budget deficit, triple the previous government's 0.8%. The European Commission's response? The first ever EU budget rejection. Markets punish Italy immediately. Italian yields hit 4-year highs. December 2018. Italy backs down. Greek PM Alexis Tsipras reportedly advised the Italian populists, "Do today what Europe will make you do tomorrow." He knew. He'd lived it. The revised deficit target, 2.04%. Barely a compromise. Total capitulation. The populists discovered what the technocrats already knew. Within the Eurozone, there is no escape from the trap. Markets enforce austerity even when voters reject it. They tried one more trick, the super bonus, a 110% tax credit for home renovations. It created an artificial construction boom. The budget deficit exploded to 8% of GDP in 2022. Temporary growth, not structural improvement. And Italy remains one notch above junk credit rating. The harsh reality? Democracy in the Eurozone has guardrails. You can vote for whatever you want, but if markets don't like it, they'll veto it with interest rates. The populists could win elections. They couldn't win against the bond market. Austerity's political unsustainability created the populists. The Eurozone's constraints defeated them. Italy remains trapped. So what happens next? October 2022. Giorgia Meloni becomes Prime Minister. First far-right PM since World War II. First female PM in Italian history. Markets braced for confrontation. Eurosceptic rhetoric, budget showdowns, crisis. Instead, they got fiscal discipline. Look at what happened to spreads. September 2022, when Meloni took office, 251 basis points. November 2025, 74 basis points, the lowest since 2010. All three rating agencies upgraded Italy in 2025. Moody's, S&P, Fitch, all stable. Italy achieved a primary surplus in 2024 for the first time in years, 0.1% of GDP, but positive. Here's something the headlines missed. The far-right leader markets feared most turned out to be more fiscally conservative than the technocrats. The ideological labels didn't predict the economic policy. So, is Italy saved? No, Italy isn't saved. It's managed. Here's how this plays out. The most likely path, call it 60 to 65% odds, is muddling through. Weak growth, 0.5% to just under 1% annually. No acute crisis. The ECB backstop holds. Debt stabilizes somewhere between 135 and 140% of GDP. Italy survives. It doesn't thrive, but it survives. Then there's the slow-motion crisis, 25 to 30% odds. Growth consistently disappoints. Spreads widen back to 200 or 300 basis points. Austerity demands return. Rating downgrades pile up. The doom loop activates, slowly but relentlessly. The acute crisis scenario? Maybe 8 to 12% odds. An external shock triggers panic. Spreads spike past 400 or 500 basis points. The ECB is forced into massive intervention. The IMF gets involved. Greece 2.0, but 10 times larger. And full Eurozone breakup? Less than 5%. Practically impossible, according to government studies. Italy's Target 2 liability of 447 billion euros creates an exit barrier. Meloni explicitly isn't pursuing it, and 71% of Italians still support the euro. If you're watching this in 2027 and spreads are back above 300 basis points, you'll know scenario B is playing out. If Italian bonds are still calm, congratulations, the Bumblebee is still flying. I've painted a dark picture, but here's the contrarian case. Italian households hold 10.4 trillion euros in net wealth. Total national wealth, $11 trillion. Only 26% of Italian households have any debt at all. The state is poor, but the citizens are rich. About 69% of Italian debt is held domestically, unlike Greece, where 80% was foreign held. Italians won't flee their own country's bonds as quickly as foreign investors. Italy has run primary surpluses in 27 of the last 33 years. The problem isn't spending, it's interest payments and low growth. The ECB backstop, the TPI and OMT programs, removes the existential risk. Whatever it takes is still in effect. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Doom predictions about Italy have been wrong for 20 years. The ticking time bomb has been ticking since 2011. Maybe managed decline is sustainable indefinitely, as long as the ECB is willing to backstop it. But the warnings keep coming. Bank of Italy Governor Fabio Panetta, 2024. Without a strong increase in productivity, this imbalance will inevitably translate into a decline in GDP and overall welfare. He added that Italy's working-age population is set to shrink by 7 million by 2050. That alone could reduce GDP by up to 11%. The IMF, July 2025. Public debt remains persistently high, significant risks from productivity disappointment and trade tensions. The European Commission. Primary surpluses still insufficient to curb the growth of the debt ratio. The debt projection, 136.9% in 2025, 138.5% by 2027, could reach 148% by 2029 under unchanged policies. In the muddle-through scenario, winners? Italian bondholders, for now. The ECB, which maintains control. Losers? Italian citizens, stagnant wages, emigration, declining living standards. European taxpayers, implicit guarantees they never voted for. And investors, low returns for high risk. Let me leave you with this. Italy's debt crisis isn't just an Italian problem. It's a design flaw in the euro itself. The Eurozone was built without fiscal union, without transfer union, without banking union. It's a monetary union without political union. Italy exposes the fundamental contradiction. You can't have one currency for 20 different economies with 20 different productivity levels and 20 different political systems. Something has to give. Return with me to Monte dei Paschi di Siena. The 550-year-old bank survived plagues, wars, and financial crises. Now, it's 64% state-owned, still not fully recovered. That's Italy. It survives. It doesn't thrive. It becomes dependent on institutions it doesn't control. Italy's debt crisis isn't a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be managed. The question isn't if the bomb will detonate, it's whether Europe can keep defusing it, decade after decade, forever. The Bumblebee keeps flying, but for how much longer? And if you haven't seen our deep dive into why Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, check it out. Links on screen. Same math, different country. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Italy muddle through for another decade, or does the next recession finally break the system?